What I feel is one of the things that I felt after listening to Professor Krishnan uh, is is that I mean he has wonderfully traced, or he has wonderful. I mean, in a very interesting way, he has shown how critical local history may be conceived within the framework of cultural studies. This is a very interesting kind of practice which probably many researchers, I suppose, or people who are planning to do researches related to such fields, they can actually take up this methodology of concentrating on particular specific areas and then work on it in an extensive manner. And I have a few observations in relation to, the resurgence of religious activities, of course. But before that, before moving on to that, there are two things that probably Krishnan sir would, I hope, respond. Because I mean, when I was listening to him, two things that cropped up in my mind as a response to the presentation. One is in the beginning, he talked about how the return of the natives, in quotes, of course, how people who returned from different parts of the country suddenly took interest in probably renovating the temples, or they in fact took a renewed interest. They had a renewed interest. I was just wondering whether this, new interest is purely religious or purely spiritual, or I mean, it had other implications, especially when they were actually returning from the rest of the country, in the sense that they were probably for a long time they were not in that particular place, and they returned. And did they really want a social recognition in terms of the religious, associations? I was just wondering about that, because something similar to that I have to raise in relation to certain church committees. Actually, I'm thinking about that. That's why this particular concern that I have. And then the second thing is, I was also wondering if the resurgence of renovation, particularly the practice of renovating ignored, dilapidated temples, whether they were accentuated, whether these renovation practices were accentuated by the popular media. In the sense, what I'm referring to is very clearly the film industry, actually. How you can see towards the end of the 80s and throughout the 90s, you find frequent references to such figures who would come up, I mean, Mantravadis or, Prasna Vakkanalkar, okay? Such figures would appear in these Malayalam films and speak about the necessity to renovate the ignored, abandoned temple, and otherwise the evils will not leave us. This becomes a very frequent, sustained reference or sustained assertion in Malayalam film industry at the at the cultural space, I mean. So I was just wondering whether that has also paved a way, or whether it has also accentuated the process of this. Directly referring to temple activities and particularly temple committees. Now, I was just wondering, religious revival is something that happens, which is quite common in 1990s. I mean, or from 1990s onwards in almost all religions, I think, in Kerala, particularly in Kerala. And this resurgence, this religious revival, I would like to link it up with two concepts that we often discuss. One is the post-secular kind of idea, and the other is the postmodern sacred, or what we call the postmodern sacred. Let me just briefly explain what exactly we mean by this postmodern sacred, and link it up with what I'm trying to say. It is the aspect of popular culture. When we say the postmodern sacred, it is that aspect of popular culture which mixes postmodern aspects with the spiritual and sacred, etc. It's the idea is consumption. So what I'm trying to, or what we actually emphasize here, is the idea of consumption of spiritual texts, primarily the consumption of spiritual texts. And texts, in quotes, of course, text could be visual or any kind of text. So you are consuming spiritual texts in maybe on visual platform, for example, religious channels. Think about the serials that were actually telecast on TV, Mahabharatam, Ramayanam, then Kadamattathu Kattanar, Velanganni Madhavu, all these serials that that were actually telecast during this period, late 80s, particularly not late 80s, in the 90s, actually, to be very precise. So in the 1990s, how these serials were or various such serials were telecast, and how it was actually forming a kind of foundation for a religious kind of revival, not a spiritual revival, of course, religious revival. So, and the audience, so this is what I mean by the postmodern sacred. You are consuming the visual space or visual text, and all these serials or representations, all these were mediated, and along with this you also have religious channels, like Shalom TV, for example, for Christians, and many other such channels. So you have a live telecast of Christian retreats on these channels sometimes, or Kurbana mass being performed, and you have telecast of all that. So all these were at the same time mediated through religiously bent advertisements, and we cannot ignore that aspect. Often, such things would be mixed with this. As a break, you would have not the usual kind of advertisements, but advertisements of church festivals, for example, or temple festivals. It could be any of those. So, and the moment we speak about festivals, we are also speaking about a capitalist space of consumer goods and mass entertainment. That's also very much part of festivals. So the advertisement of church or temple festivals would also figure as part of these, as part of consuming the religious text. So it's also capable of generating, postmodern sacred is also capable of, or what I'm saying is the religious revival that actually happened is also capable of generating divisive identity politics, particularly divisive identity politics. What I mean is it's with the advent of this postmodern sacred that you have the emergence of a number of matrimonial sites, for example, Nair matrimony, Christian matrimony, nikah, all these things, which are very different from the conventional marriage bureaus that actually existed. There was no Christian marriage bureau, or I don't know, at least I can't think of any such, or Hindu marriage bureau like that. But the social media, the emergence of social media and the visual media, particularly, that actually, what I mean is globalization, in fact, or the postmodern period, enabled this kind of a divisive identity politics, which was actually against the idea of secular politics that existed till then. So you are confining yourself to Christian matrimony sites, looking for boys and girls, or Nair matrimony, or whatever you want to. So that I think is a significant stage where religious revivalism or religious resurgence becomes very divisive as such, divisive as far. That's why I also talked about the post-secular. I used the word post-secular right in the beginning. I'll come to that very soon. So that religious resurgence is capable of keeping ourselves in niches, or in islands, separate islands. Now, this, as I said, is consumptive. It is consumptive and is in alliance with postmodern global capitalism. This religious revival is very much in alliance with the postmodern global capitalism as far as entertainment is concerned, as far as consumption is concerned. So you can also see the emergence of God men and God women in a very powerful manner during this period, And I'm not simply referring to a few people who would speak about spirituality. I'm not referring to that, but how people begin to commodify, for example, yoga, for example, yoga. So the language of spirituality changes, and it becomes a global commodity for consumption, and it becomes increasingly attributed to certain religious faith and practices, etc. So there is a very definite alliance. What I'm trying to say is a definite way in which religious revivalism in the 1990s and early 2000s, or that continues even today, of course, that has established a clear connection between, certain practices and capitalist commodities, or commodification of certain practices. But we must also remember that the postmodern sacred, or what I mean by that particular term, is, for better or worse, very different from the traditional sacred. The traditional sacred maintained a strong distinction between the sacred and the profane. Of course, there was no compromise as far as that particular distinction is concerned. The traditional sacred would always maintain that distinction between the sacred and the profane. But the postmodern sacred is capable of challenging or going beyond this distinction between the sacred and the profane. That is, whether it's for good or bad, I'm not able to say. I'm not able to make a conclusive statement about that. But this is one practice. Then another thing that I would see in relation to this religious revival, I'll conclude very quickly, is what I said right in the beginning. That's the post-secular return of religion to the public space. Now, I don't know, in my childhood, I never saw, on Sri Krishna Jayanti, for example, on the birthday of Sri Krishna, I never saw, processions in the street in my childhood. When I say in my childhood, when maybe in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But by the time you reach 1990s, what you find is all junctions get blocked on the day of Sri Krishna Jayanti. Not only on the day of Sri Krishna Jayanti, in my childhood, in churches, when there are rosary, recitation and things like that, it was taken out in the presence of the church, or it was always carried out there. But now, of late, what you find is rosary is recited on highways, national highways. Now, what happens, what I mean is, the return of religion to the public space in the post-secular period is not just a return of religion and spirituality. It's a return of asserting, emphasizing power politics. It's to show the strength of religious communities rather than emphasizing spirituality. So the return of religion is not just a return of spirituality, it's a return of power performance, you can say, in the performative sense. It's a power performance. And as far as churches are concerned, since Krishnan sir was actually talking about temple committees, I was just reminded, when I was listening to that, I was reminded of one change that has happened to churches and church committees especially in interior places. I'm not talking about cities per se. I'm talking about especially the locality from where I hail, where you have the migrant population in the northern side of Kerala. There, the churches are in interior places, not in the cities necessarily. Now, one change about church committees is that the church committees were replaced, or in the past, the local pramani, almost like the rich man in the local place, he would be a dictating figure, a very deciding factor as far as the church committees were concerned. But such figures are being replaced nowadays with the newly emergent middle class, I would say. The newly emergent middle class, when I say the newly emergent middle class, the newly emergent Christian middle class, what I mean is, particularly among the migrant population, okay? Please note that. The newly emergent middle class is, or they were made possible by their sons and daughters who have gone abroad because they've acquired skilled, education or whatever. They are skilled laborers. So they've gone to the Gulf countries, they've gone to America or wherever. So that happens in the 1990s, late 1990s. And then what happens is, so it culminates in late 1990s, you can say. But in 1990s, this is a trend. Girls are increasingly sent to nursing, and boys take up other professions, so they go abroad, and the family becomes a bit rich, or they can manage. Now, what that family actually needs, I've carefully observed the temperament of certain families around my own place, where I live, where I come from. I've seen that, otherwise, people who were very critical of practices in the church or the priests' activities, things like that. Now they've all turned very, highly, what do you say, obedient, faithful, and they are part of church committees. And what they now need is social recognition. That's why I asked Krishnan sir about the return of the native thing as well. Now, what they need is social recognition. Until recently, they were people who had no say in church committees. They were ordinary people, poor people, having no access to the so-called pramanis in the society. But now they have also become articulate. They have also become a deciding factor, because they also contribute significantly to the church and its activities, and therefore now they decide matters. So the return of religion is now in their hands, not in the hands of the old pramanis anymore, but they are the ones who would now decide. And what they are looking for is not necessarily a spiritual elevation, but more importantly, I feel they're looking for social recognition. They want recognition from the rest of the society, because until now, they were not recognized. That kind of a trend that I find. So in short, I would conclude with this statement. So in short, the resurgence of religion in the recent past is inextricably linked with global capitalism and transnational movement of people, irrespective of the religion that we are talking about, I think. And thank you so much.